All right, good morning, everybody. Trust you're all keeping well. It's again a privilege to be able to share with you today. This is the third week that he's been coming home later and later from work. And she's heated the meal twice already. And as the late hours have rolled on by, that meal's gotten cool again. And it's not him she's worried about. His life is really none of her business. She's been told that plainly. But it's the little ones she's worried about. Now it's 2.5 hours past the supper time, and the little ones are starting to whine. But they know the law of the house. The law of the house has been made clear to them, that no one has their meal until he's at home first, and he's seated behind the table, and he's taken his first bite of the meal. That's been made clear. There's no questions about that. So she tries to distract the kids with little games and little word games and ask them how their day has gone and how it's been and everything like that. But as the hours roll on by, there's a growing impatience. And it's only when that metal latch on the door is clicked and the door flings open and his hulking frame fills the doorway. And he walks in unapologetically. And as he walks into the house, he takes off his outer coat and he hangs it on the hook, and he takes off his helmet, and there's a little stand at the door, and he places his helmet on that stand. And as he places his helmet, he makes sure that insignia, that symbol, is facing everybody in the house, so that they would see that he's one of the elite, he's one of the most fierce fighting forces. And he would demand everybody in his life would give him the respect that he deserves. And he walks in unapologetically, and he takes his seat at the table, and she doesn't dare ask him what's kept him. She's done that once before. And she'll quickly put food on his plate, and as she puts the food on his plate, she, under her breath, whispers an apology in case the meal's not hot enough. And the little kids are sitting around the table now, and their eyes are all wide as mom is putting food on their plate. And they watch and they wait until dad takes his first bite before they can start eating. And there hasn't been much talk around the table. It's never really received well. But mom tries to get a little bit of small talk going, saying, "How was your day? What did you do today? Did you learn anything new?" And then she looks across the table, and there's the little girl. She's about 3.5 years old, and she's going to take a chance. And she takes a deep breath, and she says to the little girl, "Why don't you go and show your dad what you made today before you go to bed?" The little girl looks at the man, looks at him in his eyes, and he looks at her, and she sees something in his eyes, something that's a little bit different, something she's not really used to, because there's a warmth that's growing in her dad's eyes that she's not used to. And she sees this, and she pushes herself away from the table, and she runs to the corner of the room, and she comes back with a piece of string, and there's some flowers hanging on the piece of string, and she holds it up in front of him like this, and he looks at it, and she looks at him, and he says to her, "What is it?" And her long black hair and those almond eyes look up, and her smile lights up the room. And she looks at her dad, and she says, "It's a necklace." And her smile lights up that room right there. And mom, who's sitting there, her heart's beginning to explode. Her heart's beginning to explode because, as far as she can remember, that is the second sign of affection he has shown that little girl in the last 3 weeks. In fact, as far as mom can remember, those are the only 2 signs of affection he has ever shown that little girl. She will take her seat and finish off the meal, and the kids will finish off the meal, and they'll take their plates and their dishes to the cleaning rack, and they'll head off to bed. And the little girl will sleep on the bed closest to the stone wall, and her older sister next to her, and the brother at the head on his own little cot. And mom will sit beside them, and she'll run her fingers through their hair as she sings them a Roman lullaby as the last of the eyelids flutter and fall asleep. And the mom will go back to the table and clear whatever's left on the table. And she will make her husband something warm to drink, and she'll sit across him. And as she sits across him, her heart is filled with 1,000 questions that she knows she's not allowed to ask them. But tonight, she's going to take a chance. She's going to ask one. She looks at him and she says, "How was your day?" And he sits there with his huge shoulders, and he rolls the last little bit of that warm drink around in his mug, and in a moment of vulnerability, he lets it out. And he says this. He says, "I don't know what to tell you. He's different from most. He's different from any prisoner I've ever had to look after. We've never had an inmate like him before." And he quickly catches himself as though emotions are not allowed. He gathers himself, especially emotions from a man of his rank and his position, and he gathers himself and he hits straight and he snaps straight back into business. And he says, I've asked to work the late shifts tomorrow again, and I'm working the weekend too. And she nods. He doesn't need her approval, but she just nods. She doesn't know what's happening in that prison cell. She doesn't know what's happening in that prison block. All that she knows is this, that her husband, her Roman soldier, who's coming home later and later after working shifts, is becoming more and more like the man that she actually wants to be with. And that brick heart and head of her Roman soldier is starting to crumble. She takes the remaining plates to the cleaning rack and washes the dishes. And as she does that, she whispers a prayer that whatever's happening in that prison block, whatever's happening in that prison cell, that it would continue. And he retreats to his room for the night. Little does she know that this scene is being played out in home after home after home of all the palace guards who need to serve a day in that prison block because of the inmate that's sitting there. Men who have been trained to be fierce and ferocious and hardened, they're coming home a little later after working extra shifts, but they're coming home a little different. And today, friends, we're going to look over the shoulder of those prison guards, and we're going to put a spotlight on our mysterious prisoner, and we're going to look at what this man was. He was so much more than just a prisoner. He was a leader, and he was a leader who understood something that I want to just flesh out a little bit this morning as we look at this man's life. He understood a very important leadership principle, and it's this. And on the basis of what Pastor Louis and what has been shared this morning, that yes, everything is, the premise of everything that we do comes from love. But from that space, and it's this point, it's a very simple point, and it's this. It says leadership is intentional influence. But just before we explore that a little bit more, and I want to add some context to the story that I've just told you, that I want to anchor this point around. It was about 60 to 61 AD when Paul, our prisoner, arrived in Rome. He was arrested and placed in custody of a Roman officer of the imperial regiment. And these guards weren't your ordinary prison guards. They were the most elite. They belonged to an elite unit. In fact, Caesar at the time, who was emperor at the time, Caesar used to choose his own personal bodyguards from this unit. So they were the toughest, the hardest, the most feared men in the Roman Empire. They were, in today's context, they were the Navy SEALs of the day. And maybe for South Africans as we know it, hulle was die rekkies van die dag. That's who they were. They were the hardcore guys. Not the type of guys that you messed with. They got paid a little bit higher in their wages. They got given automatic Roman citizenship, which was a huge honor. And they would generally serve for about 12 years, and then they would retire. But Paul was handed over into these Praetorian guards while he was awaiting trial before he would stand before the emperor. Now, if you have this image in your head, in your mind right now of Paul being locked up in a little prison cage, 3x4, and on that same scene you would have some of these guards that I've been talking about sitting around a table over here playing some cards to waste some time, to get the time go by. I need you to get that image out of your head right now. Is it gone? That's not the image. That's not the scene that we had on the prison that day. That scene was very different. In fact, the Bible uses a word to describe his imprisonment. It uses a Greek word. The Bible uses a Greek word called hallucis. Hallucis was a short length of chain which was chained to the wrist of the prisoner and to the wrist of the guard, very short length of chain, so it was impossible for the prisoner to escape. So over the course of 2 years, while he was in that space, Paul was chained right next to one of those Praetorian guards, one of those hardcore men. And they would generally serve for about a 4-hour rotation, and then they would swap and the next guard would come on. So what would happen was Paul was under constant guard, constant check-in on, is he still around, for 4 hours on those shifts, chained to these guys. But what the authorities didn't take into consideration was that Paul was a man who was compelled by love. And as they were chained as he was chained under the constant guard of those prisoners, those prison guards, those hardcore men, were under the constant influence of a man called Paul, who was compelled by love. They didn't take that into consideration. And so these men would overhear him as he taught his fellow inmates. They would listen to him as he spoke. A lot of people came to visit him because it was a type of a house arrest, and a lot of people came to visit Paul during that time. And they would overhear his conversations that he had with them. They would hear him pray. They would be chained right next to him, right in his proximity, in his place, and they would overhear him pray, singing praises to God. They would see his courage in the midst of his persecution, and they would see the way that he would gently approach and deal with those who were persecuting him, even in that space. And they would see his loyalty. They would have front row seats. The word I'm going to use a lot this morning. They would have front row seats to his life and to his leadership and to his deepest convictions that he had with Jesus. And as his soldiers had these front row seats, as these hardcore soldiers had front row seats right there next to Paul in that close proximity, as they were in that space, in those 4-hourly shifts, these men's hardened hearts began to crumble. Everything that they stood for, everything that they fought for, started to erode during those 4-hourly shifts. And at the end of one of Paul's letters, I think it's Philippians, we actually find out that those prisoners, those guards, those hardcore men who were the fierce and the ferocious guys of the nation of the time, most feared men, they actually ended up joining the very movement that Paul was in prison for. They got saved because of the influence, the intentional influence that Paul had on their life in that space. And Paul knew that if he wanted to be an effective leader, and we're all leaders here right now, if we want to be effective leaders, Paul knew this, and we need to understand this, that if we want to be effective in our leadership, we need to be intentional in our leadership. Jesus gives us an alternative word, which is probably a more appropriate word. And instead of influence, he gives us the word discipleship. So let me say it like this. Paul knew that in order to be an effective leader, he needed to be intentional in discipling others. I think it's been used 2 or 3 times this morning, but let me bring it home to you just a little bit. You know, the big leadership question, the big leadership statement that has been used for so many years is this, and we've used it. I know you've used it, I've used it, and I've heard it so many times. It says, a man who thinks he's a leader and has no followers is only taking a walk or a stroll. We've all heard that and we've used that. And it's true. But I want to turn up the heat a little bit on that statement this morning. And I want to say this. It's all good of us having followers. But unless our leadership translates into changed lives of those who are following us, we fail. Paul's intentional behavior while he was under that constant guard translated into those men's lives being changed. We find that out in the end of Philippians. Their lives were changed, and because their lives were changed, their homes and their families were changed. And Paul knew that they would have front row seats to his life. We have people who have front row seats to our lives. As a leader, we have people who have front row seats to our lives. Paul knew that he needed to be intentional in every opportunity and leverage every space and opportunity that he had. If we stepped out of the scene just for a moment of where Paul was in prison, chained to those prison guards, if we have a wider perspective of Paul's life, we would see that once he had that Damascus Road experience, encounter with God, his sole purpose, his ultimate goal was to make sure that whoever was in his proximity, whoever was close to him in space, whoever was around him, that he would lead them to Jesus, but not only lead them to Jesus, but allow them to glorify him as well. Now, if I were you and I was sitting right there right now and some guy dressed like Batman was standing up front here and saying to me that if I have people following me, but there's no evidence of change in their lives, I'm actually failing. I'd be sitting there right now going and doing all the maths in my head right now, trying to justify my leadership. I would be going through John, bad one, David, bad one, Mark, bad one, and I'll get a good name and I go, okay, there is some justification in my leadership because there's some trail of lives being changed behind me. Don't do the maths this morning. I'm not here to tell you and to condemn you in that space. What I am here to tell you is that you have been handpicked to be a leader. That's why you're here. That's why God has positioned you in this place. That's why you're sitting here today. You have been chosen to be a leader. But I believe that as leaders, we can get better at leading. We can get better at leading. I love the way Pastor Louis wrote what he wrote in our invitation letter. I'm going to read it to you. It says, in the day and age that we live in, leadership is vital. Wherever you find yourself, it is of the utmost importance for us as leaders to continue to develop our leadership skills, abilities, capabilities, and strategies so that we can lead more effectively. I know that we can be better as leaders, and we can be more intentional in the way that we do lead. And so for us to become better leaders in the little bit of time that we have together, we're going to look over the shoulder of those guards, and we're going to look at a man whose life was changed. But what did they see when they looked over the shoulder? What did they see in Paul's life? What were the things that that changed them? What was the intentional things that Paul did that changed them? Paul led in some serious times, and some times where there were so many uncertainties and there was a lot of political instability. And as us as leaders, we live in a nation right now where there certainly is times of uncertainty. There are many unanswered questions, and there is a lot of political instability in our nation right now. Paul led in those places. But yet through them all, in the midst of his own persecution, in the midst of his own challenges and turmoil, he still remained intentional. He still remained focused on the ultimate goal of those who have front row seats to his life. And as leaders, we have many people who have front row seats to our lives. He remained intentional to say, when you're watching me, I'm going to have a goal in purpose. I'm going to lead you to the one who saves it all and who can heal it all. And as I looked at this and I looked at Paul's life, I probably came up with over 20 different things. There are different things that I would want to share with you this morning of very intentional things that Paul did as people looked at his lives, of those who had front row seats to his life. But for the sake of time this morning, I've really just picked out three things that I believe we can use in a nation and in a time like we are like now. Because our people are looking to us. They're asking questions and they sometimes look to us for the answers as leaders. That's our role. That's our purpose. And as I've put these three things aside that I'm going to share on very quickly, it's three things that we can use as leaders to intentionally disciple our people through this time of uncertainty, through this time of unanswered questions, through this time where our political system is so unstable. Number one, three things. Number one, Paul constantly reminded us that we should never waver in the truth of who God is and that He is seated on an undisputable throne. He never doubted that. There was never a moment in Paul's letters or in his writings or his understanding where he doubted whether God was seated on an undisputable throne. And he led people in the time of uncertainty where there were unanswered questions. And he gave them the reassurance that God was seated on an undisputable throne. And we need to do that as leaders. We need to remind people that when there's so much turmoil around us and when there's so much uncertainty, when there's so much time, when there's unanswered questions, we need to remind people that God isn't in heaven in that moment when the rand drops or when the petrol price goes up or when the interest rates go up. God isn't in that moment pacing up and down heaven worried. He's not. In fact, He's not even standing. He's seated on a throne that cannot be challenged and cannot be taken out from any angle. And He continued to communicate that to His people. There's not 1 ounce of anxiety in God right now, not an ounce of it in Him. And we need to portray that He is seated on an unassailable, undisputable, and unthreatened throne right now, and it cannot be challenged. And He is seated on that throne. And we need to remind our people of that. You know why we need to remind our people of that? Because you might say to me, Grant, well, I know that truth. I know that God is seated on an undisputable throne. I know that nobody can challenge Him. But you know what? Even us as leaders, when the waves come crashing in and when the storm comes in, we so easy and so often take our eyes off the truth of who God is and we look at the size of the waves. We look at the amount of the increase in the petrol price and the things that are going around us that disturb us. Never shift our eyes. You know how Paul used it, and I love this example. Paul used that unwavering truth that God is seated on an undisputable throne. It was like a ballast in his life. You know how ballast works? Ballast is in a boat, and if you don't have any ballast in a boat, which is a little bit of weight at the bottom of a boat, if you don't have any ballast in a boat, you just have a little wind, a little wave come and topple you and hit that boat, it turns over, it takes on water, and it sinks. But if there's some ballast, if there's some weightiness at the base and the bottom of that boat, it holds it there, that when the wind comes and the rain comes and the waves come, that boat will stand because it's got some weightiness at the bottom of it. And we need to apply in our lives as leaders. We need to have the weighty truths about who God is, that He's not pacing around in heaven right now, that He's seated on an undisputable throne. It needs to be like a ballast in our lives when people look at us and go, man, that person is so sure, that leader is so sure of who God is and the truth of who He is, and they're not wavering in that, and I need to follow that, and we need to influence our people because leadership is intentional influence, and we need to influence our people in that space and in that place. Those weighty truths need to be like a ballast in our life. Paul said in Romans chapter 11, 33 to 36, he says this, "Oh, how great are God's riches and wisdom and knowledge. How impossible it is for us to understand His decisions and His ways. For who can know the Lord's thoughts? Who knows enough to give Him advice? And who has given Him so much that he needs to repay it back? For everything comes from Him and exists by His power and is intended for His glory. And Paul reminds us that God is seated on a throne that cannot be challenged and cannot be taken out in any space. Number 2, and I love this one, number 2, Paul reminds them of God's faithfulness. You know, so often we need that. We need reminding of God's faithfulness in our past. I often meet with people who find themselves in a little bit of a tricky space, or life is just too much and life is too hard, and I kind of want to sit and counsel them, and I want to walk them through things. And I learned this little trick from a friend of mine. He's a clinical psychologist. He says, try this. It's called narrative therapy. And it's very much reminding people of God's faithfulness in their life. Because if you have to ask somebody, if I had to ask you right now, give me the story of your life. If this is the storyline of your life, and everything that really happens that is good, you kind of plot it on the top end of the storyline. And some of the negative things that happen in your life, you would plot down on the bottom part of your life. And depending where you are in that space right there and then, if you're just in a negative space and so many things are going wrong, and I would say to you, well, tell me a little bit about your life. By default, what we do is we quickly plot all the bad things in our life. We forget about the good things. We say, oh, this happened. I didn't get picked for the team there, and that girl did that to me, and this happened to me. And we just by default plot all the negative things in our life, and we look back at our life and we go, it's a mess. And I've had such a bad life, and everything's gone wrong. But if we step back and we allow people to have perspective, and we go, all right, you had this thing was bad, this thing was bad, this thing was bad, and we're over here right now. But step back, my friend, and I want to have you to have a look at the goodness that God has had over your entire life. Look at God's faithfulness in this time. Look at that. Even though you went through a tough time, He pulled you up and He pulled you out. And you make them step back and see the full story, that God is faithful. Even in our own nation, we have to look back at so many potential disasters that we could have had in this nation. God has been faithful to us through every turmoil, through every stage, through every place. He has been faithful, and we need to remind people of that. You know why we need to remind people of God's faithfulness? Because when we remind people of God's faithfulness in their past and in our past and in this nation, it casts a shadow of hope over our future. Because if we forget God's faithfulness in the past, if we forget what He's done for us, if we forget His goodness, we forget to factor Him into our future. And then when things do go wrong, we post the most ridiculous things on Facebook because we forget to factor God in that place and in that space, because we've forgotten Him from our past. We cannot forget God's faithfulness in our past, because when we do, we forget to factor Him into our future. And we need to rehearse. In our lives as leaders, we need to rehearse God's goodness in our lives, because when we do that, we will factor Him into our future. And as we lead this nation through this time, we need to have God right there, remembering how faithful He was in the past. And as we face what we're facing right now in this nation, He's faithful, and He will pull us through. David even said it in Psalm 77, verse 11. I love the way that he said it. He said, but then I will recall all that you have done, O Lord. I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. They are constantly in my thoughts, and I cannot stop thinking about your mighty works, O God. Your ways are holy. Is there any God as mighty as you? You are the God of great wonders. And then South Africa, as we find ourselves in this place and in this space right now and what we're facing, He says this: you demonstrate your awesome power among the nations. By your strong arm, you redeem your people. And as we intentionally influence our people and disciple them through this time in our nation, we need to remind them of God's faithfulness in our lives. Number 3, He encourages people to thirst for God in and amongst the turmoil and the challenges that we're facing. Paul was a man who pressed in hard after God. You know, if there's one thing that, as people look at my life in hindsight one day, if there's one thing I really want them to say was a testimony of my life, it would be this: that I was a man who was hungry and thirsty after God. I don't want to be known as the person who came and fixed everything and solved everything. I want to be known as somebody who was just so hungry and thirsty after God. When people look at my life, I want to stir up a hunger and thirst for more of God in their lives. Philippians 3, verse 7, he says it so well. I once thought that these things were valuable, but now I consider them worthless because of what Christ has done. Yes, everything else is worthless when compared with the infinite value of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. When he was in prison, he was singing and praising God. He could have been in that space and he could have been saying to God, God, get me out of here. I don't want to be in this place. I don't deserve in that place. But instead of doing that, he's in prison, and those who had front row seats to his life, those who were chained to him, they would have seen him say, instead of, God, get me out of here, they would be this, God, I want more and more of you, because that's who I want to be. And that's what I want you to see right now, that I want to be more and more thirsty and hungry after God. Paul often used, closing thought, Paul often used a phrase at the beginning of his letters where he would say, Paul, a servant of the Lord Jesus Christ. And he would use the word servant. It's a Greek word which is doulos, which actually means, which when it's translated, it means bondservant or bondslave. It means a servant by choice. It's a servant who's been given his freedom, but still chooses to serve his master. And you want to know perhaps what it was, the one very thing that would have changed those soldiers' minds as they were chained to him. One thing that would have really got to them. One thing that would have really influenced them. It would have been this. Before Paul was chained to those prison guards, he was first chained to his master. And that's what they saw. And that's what's changed him. And that's the type of influence he had on their lives. Paul was handpicked as a leader. You and I have been handpicked as leaders and to lead in this nation and at this time. And I want to encourage you to lead with intention, to disciple this nation with intention, because we can get through this. We will get through this. He's done it before and he'll do it again. God is faithful. But as those who have front row seats to our lives, front row seats to our leadership, what are they seeing? Are we drawing them, or are we driving them further into confusion, further into turmoil, further into a space of a downcast soul? Or are we leading them to the one, showing them to the one who can save it all and who will save it all for us? Let's lead with intention. Let's assure others that God is seated on an undisputable throne that cannot be challenged. Let's remind them of his faithfulness. And as they see our lives, as they look at us, as they watch us, may our lives stir up a hunger and thirst in their lives to know him more. Because that's first prize. God bless you.